Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I am your host Deepak. Let's extend a warm welcome to Dr. David Thorstad as he joins us on our podcast. Dr. David is currently serving as an assistant professor of philosophy at Vanderbilt University. Dr. David earned his PhD in philosophy from Harvard University. Subsequently, he served as a postdoctoral research fellow at the Global Priorities Institute, Oxford University, and as a research affiliate at the Mint Lab at Australian National University. His research primarily focuses on epistemology and value theory, bridging discussions on bounded rationality with topics in altruistic decision making and the ethics of emerging technologies. In this episode, Dr. David shares profound insights from his widely acclaimed book, Inquiry Under Bounds. Dr. David, it's an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. David, can you explain the concept of bounded rationality and how it shapes our cognitive and physical actions in everyday life? How do internal and external bounds influence our decision making?
Sure. So as humans, we're bounded in two ways. We're bounded internally. There are things we can do and things we can't. And we pay costs for doing these things. If we move our arms, we spend calories, we reason, we could have been reasoning about something else. So these are internal bounds, abilities, and costs. External bounds are the environment. We live in certain environments. We didn't always pick them, but they shape what we can do and what's going to happen. So internal bounds, abilities, costs, external bounds, environments. A good way to think about how they bear on decision making would just be to think about how you get to work every day. So, question one, should I run or should I walk? This depends a lot on internal bounds. I'm not in great shape. If I run, I'm going to be sweaty, out of breath. That means I should probably walk rather than run. Question two is about external bounds. In Oxford, I had a beautiful walk to work. There were cows, there were parks, good idea to walk. In Nashville, I'm walking by a 5-lane road, but it's really easy to drive, good idea to drive. So, this is a way in which the external environment shapes my decision. And so, these two bounds, should I run or walk? Definitely walk. Should I walk or drive? Depends on the environment, are going to combine to decide something like how I should get to work every day.
How do cognitive limitations and cost impact the way we reason and make decisions? And what role do heuristics and frugal reasoning play in simplifying complex tasks?
Sure. So we're limited in everything we do. We have limited money, limited time, limited energy, and we have to ration these things a lot or we run out of them. Maybe one of the most interesting findings lately has been in the psychology of poverty. So we looked at how material poverty affects cognition. And one of the findings that they had was that material poverty tends to breed more short-term thinking. And classically, they said, oh, this is horrible. This is irrational. Why would you do this? But of course, if you look at the environment and you look at costs, it's not irrational. Some psychologists at Princeton around 2010 said, wait a second, what changes when you're poor? You've got a lot on your mind. You got a lot of fires. You got to put them out quickly. You got to pay your bills, find childcare, to keep the heat on. These are short-term immediate problems. You think cognitively about short-term problems, short-term consequences. Why do you do this? Because this is what's important, and this is, where you want to spend your resources. So this is one example of how really we've been trying to explain shifts in human decision-making, say like short-termism that looked irrational as consequences of responding well to the kinds of bounds we find ourselves under.
Herbert Simon's work suggests a shift from substantive to procedural rationality. Can you discuss how this procedural turn impacts our understanding of rationality, particularly in the context of inquiry and decision-making processes?
Sure. So in the 1950s, we were, in the heyday of neoclassical economics. They were asking questions about attitudes. What should you believe? What should you desire? What should you prefer? Here's what they weren't asking. How should you figure out what to believe or desire or to prefer? It wasn't until the 60s we got limited information, limited attention, all that came later. And so the procedural turn says, wait a second, belief, desires, preferences, they don't just spring to our mind. They come from somewhere. Where do they come? Inquiry or reasoning or deliberation, whatever you call it. So what do you want to study? Not primarily the attitudes, but rather the processes of inquiry or reasoning or deliberation we use to come up with our attitudes, inform them and revise them and change them. So bounded rationality says, look, You look at the processes that produce our attitudes, that's where the action's at. That's how you understand human rationality, human action, human decision making.
In your book, you contrast the standard picture of rationality with the bounded rationality approach. What are the key differences between these two perspectives, and how do they influence our interpretation of human behavior?
Thanks. This is again, I think, coming a lot out of 1950s economics. We had this paradigm in economics called the standard picture, or maybe you call it like axiomatic rationality or representation theorems. It says, look, rationality is about coherence. If you prefer A over B and B over C, you got to prefer A over C, requirements like that. And rationality is just, your attitudes fit together well. Bounded rationality is not going to advocate incoherence necessarily, but we're going to want to move the discussion well beyond the question of how your attitudes fit together with one another, and we're going to want to emphasize some other important facts about being human. Number one, we want to say, look, bounds matter. I got limited cognitive abilities. I pay costs when I use them. I'm in certain environments. These have to matter rationally. They weren't in our models back then. Even limited information wasn't in our models back then. That matters. Point two, we say, look, we need to talk not about the attitudes. What's a coherent attitude is not really the question we want to ask. We want to ask what processes should we use to form our attitudes. Point three is we've got some processes in mind, namely fast and frugal heuristics. These are sets of deliberating strategies. They work well. We evolved to use them. We learned to use them. But they're a lot sometimes faster and cheaper and better suited to our reasoning. Point four is ecological rationality. So, not only the internal bounds matter, but the environment matters. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, I think, later. And the fifth thing we want to do is vindicatory. So people like, say, Danny Kahneman and Tversky are going to look at human decision making, and they're going to see people breaking coherence axioms, and they're going to say this is bad, this is irrational. And we want to get behind why are people doing these things. And once we get full explanations of why people are doing these things, say reasoning in a short-termist way or something being intransitive, we want to say once you understand why they're doing it and the bounds that made them do this, this is not irrational, this is rational. It's just the coherence-based approach isn't the full story.
Dr. David, you advocate for a theory of rational inquiry that considers boundedness. So, how does the concept of inquiry under bounds help us understand how humans engage with information and make judgments?
Thanks. I think one of the really good ways to think about this is, again, Herb Simon, the founder of the field, said, we're shifting from an information economy to an attention economy. It used to be we didn't have enough information, we needed more information, more data, and we still do need this. But increasingly, we have more information than we can process, and what we need is attention. We've got smartphones, we've got podcasts, we've got beepers, we've got emails, we've got whatever's going on outside the window competing for our attention. And one of the resources we really need to protect as consumers and as people in business is our attention. And so one of the things bounded rationality theorists have really been stressing lately is that our attention's under threat, that a lot of people are trying to grab our attention who maybe don't deserve it to make money, to, take our time. And that once we tend to think of our attention just like our information as a scarce resource that we need to protect, this is going to advocate for, say, consumer protection regulations to take our attention back. And it's also going to teach us about things like the value of deep work that are just not going to appear until we think about attention as something scarce and valuable.
Could you explain the reason-responsive consequentialist view of rational inquiry and how it contributes to the broader theory of rational agency?
Absolutely. So first, reason responsiveness and rationality. Reason responsiveness theories of rationality say, what is rationality? First, it's doing what you got most reason to do, not some reason, the most reason. And second, it's doing it because and in response to the reasons why you ought to do it. So an example would be, I've got coffee right here. Suppose I made it instead of bought it. I should boil my water before I make my coffee. Why should I do that? Well, that's what I have most reason to do. That's going to make good coffee. So rationality says boil your water before you make coffee. But that's not enough to be acting rationally. You also got to do it for the right reasons. Imagine I boil my water to make coffee, and you say, why, David, are you boiling your water? And I say, oh, it scares the tigers away. That's not actually a good rational thing to do. Why not? Because I'm not doing the right thing, but because I'm doing it for a bad reason. So you'd think that generally acting rationally is doing what you ought to do in response to the reasons why you ought to do that. And then the question is, what do you have most reason to do? And of course, in philosophy, there are many theories of what you have most reason to do. I'm going to go consequentialist here. Consequentialists say what you have reason to do is to promote value, i.e., make outcomes go as well as possible, make the world a better place. So, why should you boil your coffee? Because it's going to give you a better outcome. It's going to give you tasty coffee.
In chapter 4, you argued that there are no distinct epistemic norm of inquiry. How does this challenge traditional views on the epistemology of inquiry, and what alternative model do you propose?
A lot of views in epistemology are very focused on cognitive outcomes like truth, knowledge, understanding, coherence, above non cognitive outcomes health, happiness, tasty coffee, sleep. And this is going to be hard because traditional theories are going to say that rational inquiry is only about getting truth and knowledge and that sort of a thing. Now, if you talk about bounded rationality, something that literally everybody agrees on is when should you think fast, when should you think slow? Well, other things equal, think fast if it's less important, think slow when it's more important, i.e., importance matters. And importance, I don't mean how much truth you're going to get. I also mean, are you going to get coffee? Are you going to get healthy? Are you going to cure cancer? Importance means importance. So if we only focus on truth and knowledge and coherence and not things like tasty coffee or health as goals of inquiry, we're not going to be able to explain basic insights in bounded rationality, like think slow about what matters. And so by going consequentialist rather than, this more restrictive view, we say, yes, consequences like knowledge matter, but all consequences matter. And what we're ultimately trying to do is to make our life in all ways and, the life of others go as well as possible.
How does the concept of ecological rationality fit within the reason responsive consequentialistic framework? Can you provide examples of how the environment shapes rational decision making?
Absolutely. So once you turn to a question about processes, how should you think? There's no one answer to how should you think. It depends on the problem, depends on the case, depends on who you are. So where you are located is going to shape how you should think. I think the classic example is robins are, in a bit of a unique position. They're non-migratory birds. They don't move, so they got to defend their turf, i.e., they got to take, all the other adult male robins and chase them off. And the question is, how does a bird with a bird-sized brain learn to chase off, the other robins? And they learned a really ingenious trick, namely, you see something deep in red, you attack it. Why is this a good trick? Well, adult male robins have red bellies, so you're going to get the male robins. Children do not have red bellies, so they're not going to kill their own kids. And female robins don't have red bellies, so they're not going to chase all the women away. So this is a really good strategy in the robin's environment. Problem is when you change the environment. So you take the robin, you put it in a zoo, sees a guy with a red beard, it's going to try to kill that guy. This is not a good strategy anymore. And also, if you change it a little bit, so you take an adult male robin, you paint the belly so it's not red, it's actually not going to get attacked anymore. So you've got a strategy that works great in the robin's environment, but then, and this is what, economists would does, you lift that robin out of the environment, you put it in a new environment. Now it'd better use a new strategy because the old strategy isn't cutting it anymore.
In your work, you present a third way between bounded rationality and the standard picture. What is this middle ground, and how does it reshape our understanding of cognitive and rational processes?
Absolutely. So the first thing is I want to blame theorists rather than theories. When I turn around, I look at the standard picture. I said I don't like coherence very much, but that's not entirely true. What I've really done is I've shifted the question. Coherence was a theory about what our attitudes should be like. Consequentialism was a theory about the processes that produce our attitudes. They're really not at that level competing theories. They're rather competing questions. So the blame is going on theorists. It's like, look, there's nothing wrong per se about talking about coherence and coherent attitudes. That's just not where the action is at. You didn't say something false. You said something that wasn't maybe the most revealing questions. And the second thing we want to do is we want to blame attitudes rather than agents. So take somebody who forms an irrational belief or takes an irrational action. The poor robin jumps at the guy with the red beard. What do you want to say? Well, that was irrational. There's no reason to jump the guy with the red beard. But then you want to say, look, why did that happen? Namely, because of a rational process of reacting to information that was manipulated by some, experimenter wearing a red beard. So when you have, an irrational attitude or an irrational action or something irrational lower down, you look up at the process and you try to find rationality higher up producing it.
How does the recent Jetetic turn in epistemology focus on theoretical inquiry relate to the procedural turn in bounded rationality? What insights can we draw from the shift from for the broader study of rational inquiry?
This made me very happy when this happened at epistemology. So bounded rationality, we're all about moving up, not talking about attitudes, preferences, beliefs. We're talking about the processes that produce them. Epistemology, so that's the procedural turn. Epistemology was usually about attitudes. What should you believe? What constitutes knowledge? It was not about how you should come about figuring out what to believe or come about acquiring knowledge. And so the zetetic turn in epistemology happened while I was finishing my dissertation at Harvard. We said, let's move to these higher questions about how to figure out what attitudes to have. I was looking at this. I said, darned if it doesn't look like the same thing. Bounded rationality people say less attitudes, more processes. Epistemology people say less attitudes like belief, more processes that form belief. I said, wow, this looks like the same thing. And so I've argued that these are the same thing, these are the same turn, that we really have exactly the same reasons to take both of the turns. And because we've already taken one of them in bounded rationality since, the 1970s, if we look at how that turn played out, over the last 50 years in bounded rationality, we can maybe gain insights for epistemology, which is just starting to take this turn.
Dr. David, my last question. Finally, you suggest that practical attitudes like our belief and decisions are also influenced by bounded processes of inquiry. How can this understanding of inquiry be applied to practical philosophy and real world decision making?
Absolutely. So go back to the psychology of poverty. Remember, the thought here was if you're in a situation of material poverty, you've got a lot of short-term challenges. So what you want to do is think about short-term challenges, short-term costs. Now, say you're not a very scrupulous person. You say, wait a second, folks are thinking a lot about short-term challenges. They're not thinking about long-term challenges. What am I going to do? I'm going to offer them payday loans at horrible rates, banking on them not having enough attention to realize what's being done. So you do this, and this is a really good way to make a lot of money because you've got people who don't always have the attention or the time to figure out a way around this and can sometimes be trapped into loans at rates they really shouldn't be taking. So say, somebody takes a loan that they really shouldn't be taking, and as a result, things go badly. You can't pay it back. You lose your home. You lose your house. The question is, what should society do about this? And there's one view that says, look, it was irrational to take the loan. You couldn't pay back the loan. It's your own fault. We don't owe you a car. We don't owe you a house. We don't even owe you, regulation to stop loans like that. And that's kind of the attitude focused position. There's also the process focused position that the reason you took the loan was based on a rational allocation of time and evidence, which led you to take the loan. And because it wasn't your fault, you were acting rationally, this kind of a person's going to say, we should help you get another home. We should help you get another car. And we should probably put in regulations so that people can't charge 200% interest every year. So one way that we're going to get practical relevance of bounded rationality is in looking at very practical things that happen to people that look irrational, making them look rational, and getting a moral injunction for society and for regulators to help out in these situations.
Listeners, thank you for joining us on today's episode with Dr. David Thorstad, where he shared invaluable insights from his research focused book, Inquiry Under Bounds. We hope you enjoyed the discussion and gained a deeper understanding of the challenges and opportunities that come with being bounded agents in a complex world. Stay tuned for more thought provoking episodes. Dr. David, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you for your invaluable contributions.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.